I don't know if anyone actually took a break, but you were allowed to just take a break for like a half an hour. Didn't know so many people are so into validations. It's great. We're going to talk about the last kind of set of validations, and we kind of allotted the most time for this because I think it's the most important maybe, and maybe the least intuitive out of all of them. Calibration curve, I'm going to talk a little bit about the experimental design of a calibration curve, and then a little bit about some of the various computational assessments. Feel free to stop, especially if you're kind of in the process of making calibration curves, or if you've never done it before and you're not sure how to go about it. This is the time to utilize your fellow colleagues, other experts in the room, and ask some of us. I think all three of the instructors today have made loads of calibration curves. The two main objectives, again, I'm going to give you a lot of detail, but as long as you take away these 2 points, then you have accomplished your goals for this lecture. One is to understand the major points, pun totally intended, of calibration curve experimental design, and the second is to gain an appreciation of some of the data requirements. Different analysis methods for calibration curves require different things from the data, and pretty much every single way to analyze a calibration curve has a slightly different statistical definition for what the LOD and the LOQ are, and it's okay that there's so many different definitions as long as you understand what your definition of LOD and LOQ is, and you are forthright with that in your write-ups. So this is just to remind you again of all these figures of merit that we had reviewed. We talked about linearity, we talked about reproducibility, we talked about the idea of a noise threshold at the bottom of our signal axis, our y-axis, and we talked a little bit about LOQ. So kind of to orient you and where we are in space, we're kind of getting down into the weeds of our signal. I told you a little bit about how peptides are not equal proxies. And I had shown you this figure that showed 2 different peptides from 2 different calibration curves, because every peptide has its own individual calibration curve because those Y values are going to be different for every single peptide. But maybe the X values are the same for all of the peptides in your calibration curve. Maybe you have some equal molar mixture of peptides that you're going to spike into some dilution series. But then every single peptide will be measured individually because they'll all have different Y values. We're going to talk now about how you actually make these X values, these X samples. So does everyone feel kind of properly oriented to talk about X values? Yeah? So one of the first points, just to start out with, is that you have to have some representative sample matrix to bake your curve in. You can't just buy your peptide standards and dilute them in water unless for some weird reason you're measuring peptides in water. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're like an environmental scientist and you're measuring water. Your representative sample matrix should be the same organism, the same tissue type. If you're measuring, for example, people, considerations might be gender or age, and making sure you have a matrix that represents all the various metadata that might be accompanying your different samples that you'd be measuring the analytes in. So, for example, when I'm making a curve out of yeast lysate, if I'm going to perturb my yeast in any way, maybe I take that into consideration and I make a matrix that's a pool of these different perturbations that I might do that might affect the sample, the matrix background. One important note, if you look in the CPTAC guidelines, I know my first intuition was, well, I'll just make a big giant bulk sample matrix and just do a bulk digest and be done with it. One of the notes in the CPTAC guideline was that this might actually bias your results because the way things digest in bulk might be different from how they digest in a limited sample volume or a limited sample amount. So that was an interesting note that I wanted to make sure I told you in case your first intuition was the same as mine, and I said I'd just grow up a liter of yeast and digest a whole liter of yeast or something. An important note is that you have to have enough of your sample matrix to be able to span the different points of your curve. So that's enough sample matrix to, in CPTAC guidelines, have at least 6 points in your curve, and having a blank, that's 100% of your sample matrix, and then to be able to formulate some series of dilutions. I have 2 red arrows coming out of my peptide standards and into the sample matrix, because although my first intuition might have been to just do one single serial dilution, spike in my sample and then serial dilute down, best practice is to have at least 2 sets of serial dilutions. So maybe I spike in my top point and then I separately spike in my next point to account for any pipetting error. One more note, we had talked about this a little bit over the break, but someone had asked about, well, in Skyline I can normalize to the heavy. Why can't I choose normalize to the light? And you can. So this is under your peptide settings, under modifications. At the bottom of that screen, you have the option to set your internal standard type to heavy or light. I think it's automatically set to the heavy, but you can change it to the light. And one example of when you might want to do that is in a calibration curve. If you're making, I think, what is maybe most commonly called a reverse curve. I don't know if it has a more formal name than reverse curve. You might have the endogenous level of your peptide might be present in this matrix, but what you can control for is the different concentrations of the heavy. So that might be a situation where your light is fixed, but your heavy is changing, so you might want to normalize to the light in that situation. So that was a pretty intuitive question that I wanted to address. Your dilution series should span whatever orders of magnitude you expect to see in your samples. So 6 points might not be enough. You might need to do more points than 6. If you have a blank and you expect your analyte to range between 1,000 femtomoles and 0.1 femtomoles, you might need more curve points to adequately describe the shape of that curve. And I'll be showing you some curve data in a little bit. One way oh, Brendan has a comment. I'm not sure I follow. One more time. They use the endogenous light peak area. Right.
Well, for the curve, then now if I want to go and say, what is the concentration of, now I've got some samples, I know samples. How exactly do I determine what the concentration is?
Yep.
Now this one you have. So now they're spiking and heavy as a like,
oh yeah.
You do the curve with a ratio that is
yeah. Yeah. So this is confusing because Skyline has a calibration, and I think Skyline calls it a curve, but this is for a different application, right? This is not to convert peak area to different units. This is to calculate the LOD and the LOQ, if that was unclear. This is kind of the more conventional definition of a calibration curve, for calculating figures of merit, LOD and LOQ. I mean, if this isn't clear, please feel free to ask questions. If everyone doesn't ask questions, I assume this is old news and everybody kind of knows it. So no questions? Yeah. Yeah. I think most typically it's different concentrations of heavy peptides because you're doing all these validation experiments and you have some candidate target list of peptides that you have ordered synthetics for. Yeah, dilution curve. Yep, you can definitely think of it as a dilution curve. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any more questions? I mean, it's definitely, if you've never done one of these before, I think it is pretty confusing. So I would expect questions if you haven't done one before. So now you can imagine you have some set of samples ranging from a very high concentration of your spike-in all the way down to no concentration of your spike-in, just the endogenous background, the blank. And then the next step would be to acquire these curves. So when you acquire these, I think it's very different from how we might typically think about acquiring a sample, because in a calibration curve, you're not going to do any randomization of the samples. You're going to acquire from the blank up to the highest concentration point, and then do another replicate from the blank to the highest concentration point, and another replicate from the blank to the highest concentration point. Does anybody already know why you would do blank to the highest concentration point? Why wouldn't you randomize these? Carryover, yeah. Yeah, so if you go from the blank to the highest concentration point, any analyte carryover between this sample and the next sample would be negligible compared to the new concentration of analyte you're putting on the column. So this is just a way to kind of safeguard from any potential carryover you might have. I think most of the people I've talked to like to run like a blank, a solvent blank, not a curve point blank, but a solvent blank in between these to assess that there's no carryover between their highest concentration point and their next blank sample, curve blank sample. One last note, because I've gotten burned on this before, is in step 2, when you're making your serial dilutions, make sure you have enough sample to get all of these replicates, because nothing is worse than getting to that last replicate and pulling from an empty tube. Anybody else get burned by calibration curves before? Yes. Anything in particular? The same thing? Yeah.
Well, actually, I ran out of matrix.
Perfect. Yes. Step 1, making sure you have enough matrix is another. Yeah, yeah. Having enough matrix in step 1 is definitely important. Absolutely, definitely. Because I said 6 would be the minimum number of points, but I've definitely encountered the same thing where if you do the curve and you don't capture that canonical kind of hockey stick shape, you got to start over again because you did not capture where the LOD, LOQ is. So having too many points is way better than not having enough points, unless you really like redoing bench work. If you like that, then go for it. Any more questions about this? I think that's calculating dilutions can be very tricky, especially because you need to make sure each one of these curve points has enough volume, and if you're drawing from an upper curve point to do a serial dilution for a lower curve point, you need to make sure you account for that when you're doing your math. I think that's everything that comes to the top of my mind for what I've messed up in curve points before. Yes?
For our big study that was published in 2015, we wanted to not make the same mistake we made in the previous study where, we didn't go down to the low enough spike level, so all of our curves were within that linear range. But it's hard to know what the LOD and LOQ is unless you know what the LOD is. You don't know what it is.
Recursive.
Figure out what it is. So we generated a 16-point curve that we had some selected sites carry out in triplicate or quadruplicate. So 16 for concentrations, 1 blank. And from those data points, we were able to figure out a curve with lesser concentrations. So sometimes doing that initial very thorough check of here's my high, here's my low, and then intersperse the amount of points in the T. And then the curve that you would run from the T would be very well distributed to your sensitivity range. It's generally a good way to go about it. Sometimes you get really lucky and it's that inflection point, but it's easier to that data.
Yeah.
Do you ever stack the points closer to the end of the spectrum than you would expect the majority of your samples to be?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, You might do a whole magnitude at the top end or something, and then kind of space them more closely together as you think you're getting closer to the LOD, LOQ. And I'll talk a little bit about how some methods for analyzing curves rely on that for determining what the LOD, LOQ is. Other methods are less brittle to that and are more forgiving for capturing the inflection point, even if you don't have a ton of samples drawn from that kind of elbow of the curve. But that sets me up pretty nicely for getting into computational. So this is going to be available to you in the slides, and it's just kind of a written thing of everything that I just said in case you're venturing into calibration curves. It's just all the things that I just verbally said to you. Make at least 6 curve points, generate enough of each point for 3 injections, blah, 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 all of this. So let's look at what curve data looks like. So I talked about how kind of the canonical shape of a calibration curve is like this hockey stick kind of shape. What the data looks like, if you were to look at the chromatogram, is that they should be decreasing as you decrease, the chromatogram should be shrinking as you decrease the concentration. And that's all these types of calibration curve figures are showing you. They're showing you that for different concentrations, I'm getting a decrease in the intensity or the abundance. I just said that this is the canonical shape, but real life is not always canonical. So some other shapes of curves that you might see are, like Sue was saying, this completely linear curve. So this is a symptom of not having enough points at the lower concentration range. So this is in the blank. There's clearly some value of signal. So there's some value of background here. There's some value of noise. And somewhere between this lowest point and this noise point is actually where the LOD is. You just can't assess it because this is a totally linear set of calibration curve samples. The other thing you might get is you didn't quite go high enough to capture your LOD or LOQ. So that's what I'm showing you on the right here. This is an example of maybe a peptide where the curve is actually supposed to happen between these 2 points. You see way up at the top is where the signal is for this highest 1000 point. So you can imagine it's gonna go up linear from there if that's where my curve point is. So on the left, I didn't go low enough. On the right, I didn't go high enough. And Goldilocks in the middle is where you would want your curve points to be. So, yeah. The LOD and LOQ on the top of the figures, I will tell you in a little bit. It is MS Stats. MS Stats can do figures of merit now. But I'm not going to get too much into that because I don't want to spoil your MS Stats for later this week. So there's a lot of different ways you can analyze calibration curve data. This is a giant chart I have compiled for you. You don't have to look too closely because I'm going to walk through it a little bit. The different columns I have on the left are all the different methods I've been able to find in the literature for calculating LOD, LOQ. In the middle here are some of the data requirements that these methods assume your curve data includes. Over here is the statistical model. Some of these use statistical models to, like a line, what kind of line they use to fit the data. Over here is what the method defines as the LOD and LOQ, and then finally a citation, so you can read more in your unproductive time. I'm going to focus on a couple of these. One is going to be the %CV method, which I think is pretty common for our field. A couple of the requirements that this, there we go. Some of the requirements in the data that this has is one, that there is some dilution series, and two, that there are replicates of that dilution series, because to calculate a CV, you need replicates, right? So in this, the LOQ is generally defined as the point at which the %CV goes above 20%. So you would make some calibration curve and you would define the LOQ as being wherever the dilution point goes, or just before the dilution point goes above the 20% CV. You can get fancier with this and try to infer between points where the LOQ has, where the percent CV of your measurements has increased above 20%. But I think this is pretty common and is, I think, best done if you have lots of points, because then you can really finely tune where the percent CV increased above 20%. This is something you can do in Skyline using that percent CV thing. You can very easily pick out just visually in between 2 points where the CV passed some 20% threshold. Does anybody typically use this? Is this a favorite of anyone? Yeah, pretty common, I think. When you're looking at the data, like I was just saying, if you had, for example, some calibration curve, you can do the sample grouping like I did with the annotations. So this is just some curve that I think is the opposite of the way Sue likes to label her curve. So I had A be my highest point, all the way down to J being my blank. And in the peak areas, you can kind of see that this has got some kind of canonical calibration curve shape. I can group these by all transitions. So this is showing the individual transitions. I'm showing the total of the transitions. And then I can select the peak area CV and tell that from 5, 15, so somewhere over here is my LOD, or is my LOQ if I'm using the 20% method. So is that clear? Does anyone have questions about using percent CV? Yeah?
I guess I don't understand how the LOQ would be down here when that clearly there was a kind of a flattening out of the curve.
Up here?
I mean, yeah, I mean, to me, like, just visually, I would think the LOQ something is like A or B.
Oh, really? You put it up here?
But I guess that's what the question is. I'm not sure how you get.
So the problem is that scale is like categorical.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So they're saying categorical. My sample groups here are labeled with letters. These are just categories. They're not like actual values, so you have no idea what, like this could be 10,000 and this could be 5,000 and this could be like 10 or something, I don't know.
So the X scale is the intervals are constant, whereas the Y scale intervals are probably intervals in log scale. So so it's like that 1.5 or something.
Yeah.
That's not very serious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is J a blank?
J is a blank.
So to me, like, if that's 0, right, and then if G is a low point and G and J are similar, I'm just not sure how you assign that as LOQ if it's similar to basically what you're seeing as a background.
Yeah, so here, this is above 20, so you wouldn't say this is LOQ, you would say it's S if anything. Yeah, it does break down. I mean, none of these methods are perfect, right? So this is kind of an example where I'm really accurately measuring the background, right? Because you can tell over here, whatever my noise is, I'm actually doing a pretty good job of measuring the noise.
So I guess that not to be that horse, we'll stop the comments after this last comment. But like,
It's totally fine.
Like that's a point that the background is like it's just a constant signal, so you're going to see it's going to look sort of relatively stable across the number of times you do your sections. So I guess to me, I just like visually, I'm just thinking that LOQ is going to be far higher than anything even remotely close to the background signal. That's all.
By another method, it would. By this method for this peptide, under these
case.
conditions, is not true. So I could have picked a better, more maybe typical or textbook example of a peptide where the CV just keeps increasing the farther you go. But I kind of like that this one generated some conversation because that sets me up for talking about some of the other models that are maybe a little bit more statistically rigorous in assessing this, because clearly this percent CV style method does break down. It assumes that your data follows this kind of assumption that CV will always keep increasing as you get lower and lower in your dilution. Your signal will vary more and more as you get lower and lower input values. So Quasar is a tool that got mentioned earlier today by Sue. So this is what a lot of the CP Tech study used to calculate their LODs and LOQs. It's a more rigorous data model than using the %CV method. This is incorporated into Skyline as an external tool, so this is something you could still be using within the Skyline ecosystem to assess LODs and LOQs. The external tool looks something like this, where you can get you can generate all of these plots for calibration curves, LOD and LOQ tables, CV tables if you still want to see what the coefficient of variance is for all of your peptides. I think one of the important options here is that I think Quasar works best, the model works best when there are standards present. So if you don't have internal standards, I'm not entirely sure if Quasar will work for you. If you do have heavy standards, I think Quasar is probably a pretty rigorous model for you to use. It'll work.
So the only component that won't work is audit, what is required for audit is internal standards and at least 3 replicates per concentration.
Yeah.
And audit will report out anything that has too high a
So Quasar will generate plots like this for all of your peptides, where these different colors, different shapes over here are the different transitions for your peptides. So Sue was showing you plots similar to this earlier, where you can kind of see how reproducible all of these transitions are being measured for some amount of time, and then they kind of evolve when you start getting towards the LOD, LOQ. This is an example of a much worse peptide that's maybe more realistic, where the accuracy, the precision of measuring these transitions evolved much faster in the concentration curve compared to this maybe more idealistic peptide. So you can use Quasar to generate this type of data. Quasar does require the dilution series, but I don't think necessarily requires the replicates unless you want to use audit. I think it's possible to run it without replicates, you just don't get to run audit. Sure.
And then it'll also be influenced if you have an signal or some non-zero signal like that is measured and that'll give your LOD.
Yeah. So that kind of gets at, if you look over here, some of these methods define LOD and LOQ the same. So Quasar actually, I think, was inspired by this earlier 1989 Anderson work where they defined LOD, LOQ similarly, but the model that Monty and Sue used here was a different line. They modeled it with a different line. The last and most recent software to analyze calibration curve data was incorporated into MS Stats. It was Cyril, who is right here at Northeastern and is probably in the room over there listening to me talk about him. So if you see him running around, you can talk to him all about his nonlinear regression. So these are the plots that I was showing you earlier when I showed you kind of the ideal canonical shape in the middle, and then I didn't get enough points at the lower end, and then I didn't get enough points at the upper end. Here's for calibration curve. So the way Cyril is calculating this, finds the variance in the blank, and then uses a statistical method called bootstrapping to calculate confidence intervals around the fit of this calibration curve model. So it's very statistically rigorous, and he defines his LODs and LOQs as being the points at which the variance intersects with either the average best fit or the confidence interval of the linear section. So he's kind of modeling, this is what I think the noise looks like, and this is what I think a signal looks like, and now I'm going to define my LOD, LOQ as the intersection of the noise with my signal. So this is a method that just got, I think, published earlier this year. So in your copious spare time, you're welcome to also read that. You didn't know you were going to get homework from this course.
One thing on that real quick.
Yeah.
I was wondering about it earlier. When you're doing the fitting the regressions, is there anything that outputs the LOD statistic or whether it's normally distributed? Because that definitely doesn't look like it. So I don't know how you calculate confidence intervals for something that's
How this data is normally distributed?
yeah, about the initial fit line.
Oh, how does he do the initial fit? That's actually a good question. I'm not sure how he fits, how he chooses parameters for that initial fit. I know it's GLMNet in R, but I don't know the specifics of that. That'd be a great question for him, though. All of the code's open source, if you're curious how that works. But this is in MSStats, just like all of these other methods, it has some requirements for your data. And the definition that they set for the figures of merit, you need to just make sure that you acknowledge what those definitions are. So the conclusions, this was another large data dump of references for you to sort through. But I think the main points are that every peptide in every matrix is going to have a different LOD and LOQ. You shouldn't expect the same peptide measured in different matrices to have the same LOD, LOQ because you're changing kind of the noise in all of those. Even if you think you're keeping the signal the same, your signal to noise is changing across all of them. Different peptides respond differently, even if they're in the same matrix. So even peptides from the same protein are going to have different LOD and LOQ due to all those magic bullet points that I talked about before. Curve design, I think, is somewhat unintuitive, so I gave you a little kind of checklist to go through. But I think when you go to do it yourself, the best way to learn how to do it is to make a bunch of mistakes doing it and just learn the hard way. I think it's important that we think about or consider our computational analysis before we design the curve, because how you design the curve is going to be influenced by what your downstream statistical model is going to be. So if you require, 3 replicates in your blank because you're trying to calculate the variance of the blank, that's something to think about before you design your curve and only have 1 blank replicate or something. And then finally, all of these different models have slightly different definitions for what LOD and LOQ is. So just kind of be aware of that and kind of know when to acknowledge what your definition of LOD and LOQ was. Are there any more questions? Sue has a comment.
So because characterization calculate LOD and LOQ, it doesn't necessarily mean that whatever method provides for noise.
Yes, that's a great point.
I'm not saying about anyone here, but I have encountered scientists in LA who have selected the method of LOD calculation to reflect the best sensitivity of their assay. That said, the most prudent thing to do is whatever method you choose, once you calculate how you value your limited detection of the computation, you compare that sample at that concentration. Prudent with replicates, so you can get the coefficient variation. And I can also say now that I work for a vendor, limits of detection or something that are a bit of a hot button topic because they can be calculated in different ways. So Agilent came out with something called implicit detection limit, where they inject 10 times at some concentration their analyte, they get the area, and the standard deviation of that measurement. And they just do a test and a limit table to include this coefficient to calculate that detection limit. And it's a valid method of doing it, but it does extrapolate what the LOQ is. But then, and this is what I was talking about, they go in and they called an injection to show, yes, you can detect at that interpolated or extrapolated level, there's the CV is mixed. So whatever you do, don't make people more sensitive than others. Just make sure you have the comment because somebody's going to comment and call yes.
Yeah, peer review. Man, reviewer 2. Now you know Sue is reviewer 2. She's the one making you do extra experiments. Any questions on calibration curve design or all of these analyses? Is everyone mostly using %CV as their method? Anybody inspired to try Quasar or MStats now? Yeah. Yes. How often? Ooh, I think that's totally dependent on your experiment. How often do you do calibration curves? Yeah, I usually do pretty small experiments, like maybe 20 samples or something, so I don't really do full calibration curves.
You can get around doing full calibration curves by deviating levels, so low, medium, and high, where the low is very close to your lower limit of computation, and your upper is near your upper, and those is in the middle. And as long as those values adhere to the same trickle line that your statistical curve generates, then you'll be able to say, all right, this sample set is running comparison to these when they're in the curve, or like the next curve. Now, I don't do things to how this is.
We're using the word calibration curve.
Yeah.
How you use the word calibration curve. This is really different than the LOQ. And I'll just build up what the here. The C on the side is putting together their guidance document. They're going to define the LOQ as the lowest concentration of the CD in 20%. You know, that linear solution to that point, you recover the concentration. That's the definition of linearity. So linear and precise, that's what they want to make. Then you have to validate it by taking the sample that's about 20% bigger than higher than the understand the curve that we have precise ideally so that's going to be the way it's done. That's not what all the researchers are going to do.
Yeah.
So how often do you run a calibration curve? You run it every day. If you're using calibration curve, if you're in the ratio, if you're just using this kind of standard division experiment, you might know you only have to do it once. But then it's great. It's just that you have a sample. It's just a motor all every day. What if you can see that? That's really cool. It's a little dirty. Pretty soon you're integrating drafts, and then it's integrating really fine. And it's very stable, but it's absolutely easy. So having any of the signals and noise is very well done. That's a responsible way to do it. So establish LOQ and validate LOQ. You only do one. You're doing a single batch of your experiment. You would do LOQ. Just go with it and that.
Yeah.
Also, one of the latest shows the plate layout where it's actually got everything a lot small molecule research where it's required to have calibration. They just have calibration wells on every plate. Other than times where, like somebody changed graphics and that LOQ like went up like the whole plate. And so if you want to be able to use that data, you need the whole calibration curve. If you also want to validate and use that data, then you have to just use like this one route. And you might end up throwing out like whoops, it went up, my linear rate changed, and now I can't actually work it out.
It's a delicate balance though, because of the different level, I'm going to be able to run a calibration for one day.
Yeah.
Right? Because the solvent calibration of those things take long. So when I get
Yeah.
but for the smaller molecule, I think it's more common because the flow rates are higher, it can do 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So I think, what are you comfortable with, and are you prepared for a while something like on other or some things we
Yeah, just as long as you're transparent about what you did and why you did it, I think that is kind of what it all boils down to. Any more questions on calibration curves, analytical methods?